I don't want to elaborate on that because I want you to listen to our speakers today. So we give the chance to speakers to share their insights. We have developed this seminar revolving around 4 thematic groups: memories of capitalism, memories of slavery. And tomorrow we will devote the day to memories of colonialism and the idea of neoliberalism and its victims. Also, I would like to say that this activity has been well accepted by the European Commission. It's also funded by the European Commission. And there was a good buy-in by the audience. So I'd like to welcome you all because we have too many participants. You have shown your interest in this activity. Hopefully it will be a fruitful discussion. Hopefully it will happen on such event next year and we could gather in Brazil. And I'll give the floor to my colleague, to Fernando Nicolazzi, so he can make his initial remarks. Thank you so much.
Celeste, muchas gracias. Bom, eu vou
Thank you so much, Celeste.
falar em português.
Good afternoon.
Gostaria
I'll
de
speak
iniciar
Portuguese.
agradecendo a
I'd like to
participação de
start by
todos e
thanking
todas
everyone for
nesse
your
seminário
participation
preparatório
in this
Memórias do
seminar,
Capitalismo,
this
uma
preparatory
excelente
seminar,
parceria do Laboratório de
Memories of
Estudos
Capitalism.
Políticos do Passado
It's
e
about the
do
political uses of the
Observatório
past
Europeu de Memória.
and the European Observatory for Memories.
Eu queria
Those
começar
are
com uma
our partners.
apresentação muito breve sobre a ideia também
Brief presentation on the idea,
que a Celeste colocou, a ideia que
as Celeste said, and I'd like to complement with the idea that
para investigar as memórias do
capitalism. Our partnership revolves around the memories of capitalism. Capitalism is evolved, and this is how the American philosopher Nancy Fraser began her essay on Marx's hidden abode in 2014. The phrase was taken up again in a recent book entitled Cannibal Capitalism. This idea is also present among other authors, female authors in the collection Capitalism, the Re-Emergence of a Historical Concept, published in 2016. Marcel van der Linden was one of the authors. Although it can be questioned whether at some point capitalism really ceased to be present in intellectual discussions since the end of the 20th century, the fact that today, in the first quarter of the 21st century, there's the talk of the return of capitalism seems to be significant, that there is an eagerness to place or put this concept back at the center of contemporary debates, as well as the economic system, political ideology, social form, or even culture that are linked to it. However, how to put it back in this central position, from which theoretical instruments, from which analytical perspectives, from which political positions, from which objects of investigation? These are the questions that the seminar aims to answer. In the case of the Memories of Capitalism project, there is an approach to studies of the memory, political issues of the past, spaces for remembrance, memory practices, among other possibilities. They can pave an interesting way for our discussion and insights. So this is a preparatory seminar for the face-to-face event scheduled to take place in the second part of the year in Porto Alegre. Celeste presented the 4 theoretical axes around which the seminar revolves. There is introductory session, Memories of the Capitalism, Memories on the Timeline, and there are 2 approaches involved: capitalism in the experience of time and memory production. So the chronological bias, different cultural conditions and social conditions influencing the relationship to the past. And the second idea, the specificities of the memorialization process of capitalism, considering the 10 trends of the abstraction system to acceleration, alienation, and its naturalization. To do so, we invited Carolina Rey, which is a researcher of the Germania Institute of the Social Sciences Faculty in Buenos Aires, Barbosa Pereira, teacher of the History Department of the Federal University in Bahia.
Cada uma terá até 20
Each
minutos
will
para
have
suas
up to 20 minutes
intervenções, né?
for
Em
the
seguida, a gente vai para uma
presentations.
breve
And
discussão
after
sobre o
that, we'll
tema
have
e
a
a gente
brief
passa para
discussion
a
on the
segunda
topic.
sessão do
And then we
dia
move on
com
to
a
the
mesma
second session of the
dinâmica. E ao
day
final, a
with the
gente
same
terá um
dynamics. And at
tempo,
the end,
então,
there will
para as
be some
perguntas do
time
público
for
para as
the
duas mesas,
Q&A
tá? Então,
for the
Carolina
two
Rea, Ana
roundtables.
Carolina Barbosa
Carolina
Pereira, em nome do
Rea and
Lupa, em
Carolina
nome do
Barbosa
Neuron, eu gostaria de agradecer
Pereira, on
você
behalf of
muito por
Lupa and
terem
Neuron, I'd like to thank
aceitado
you
o
for accepting
convite.
our
É uma
invitation.
imensa alegria podermos contar com as
It's
intervenções de
a
vocês.
joy to
E eu
count
queria
on
também
your
mencionar que
presence and presentation. I'd like
esse evento
to
também conta
mention that
com o financiamento
this
do
session
CNPq.
is funded
Então,
by
de
the
imediato, sem mais
CINI
delongas, eu passo a
PK.
palavra à Carolina Rea
Now,
para
without
fazer as
further
suas
ado, I'll give
colocações.
the floor to Carolina Rea for her presentation.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Bueno, primero
Thank you so
les
much.
agradezco a
First of all, I'd
ustedes, a
like
los
to thank you
organizadores y
all. I'd like
organizadoras
to
del seminario por la invitación.
thank the
La
organizing
verdad que
committee
estoy muy contenta de
for the
estar acá
invitation to the
porque
seminar. I'm very
estos
happy to be
temas
here
estoy
today.
investigando hace
These
muchísimo
topics,
tiempo y
I've been researching into this topic
es
for a long
un
time,
entusiasmo y me desvelan,
and I'm
como
very
digo yo, no me
enthusiastic,
dejan dormir,
and
así que me encanta
they
hablar de
don't
esto.
allow me to fall
Es
asleep. I
hermoso
love
hablar de
these
estos temas
issues. I love to
me
tackle
encanta
these
que se
issues,
masifiquen y que podamos
and
hablar de
I
esto.
love it when they
Pero
are
quiero chequear que me
streamlined.
escuchan bien, así
Can you
que
hear me well?
está
I
todo
just
bien, se
want to
escucha bien
do a
el
sound check.
audio.
Can you hear me well?
Así que
Can you
bueno,
hear me loud
muchísimas
and clear?
gracias a ustedes por la
Well, thank you
invitación.
so much for the
Y
invitation, as I said.
bueno, este trabajo
This work,
que le puse un nombre complicado.
the title is quite tricky.
Experientialidad en la temporalidad
Experientiality
neoliberal,
in the neoliberal
de olvidar,
temporality,
olvidar. Los parámetros yoicos
to
y la
forget about what's
fugacidad de lo
forget.
instantáneo. Se inscribe en realidad
Briefness of
en un
the
proyecto de
instant
investigación y
moments.
en una línea
It's based on
de
a research
investigación más
process,
amplia
a
que
line of
venimos
investigation
trabajando
that is quite
hace muchísimo
open. We
tiempo
have been working on
en
that for a long
proyectos de
time
investigación
in
que
the research
dirijo y que
project
formo parte
that I am
en la
leading, and I'm
Universidad de
part
Buenos
in at
Aires,
the Buenos Aires
en el
University,
Instituto de
at
Investigaciones
the
del Gino
Research
Germani,
Institute of the
y,
Sin of the Money.
y que trabajo con líneas teóricas a grandes
And I
rasgos que se
develop
inscriben
theoretical
en
lines.
el cruce entre dos tradiciones teóricas
It's
particulares
at the
del
crossroads
materialismo histórico y el
between two approaches
psicoanálisis,
of
como para
historical
describir un
materialism
poco
and
desde
psychoanalysis
dónde
to
hablo, ¿no?
define my approach.
Y dicho esto,
That being
a
said,
mí me gustaría charlar hoy con
I'd like
ustedes
to share with you
sobre el olvido, ¿no? Pero
about
más que nada
forgetting,
sobre olvidar. Y ahí está toda la
about
cuestión.
how to forget.
No me interesa hablar hoy sobre
It's
lo
about
que olvidamos en
forgetfulness and oblivion. I
capitalismo,
don't want to talk
sino
about what
que me
we
interesa
forget
traer hoy y
about in
hablar
capitalism, but I'd like
precisamente
to
sobre
discuss
cómo
precisely
olvidamos, del
how we
proceso
forget,
de
the
olvidar,
whole
porque
forgetting
creo
process.
que la configuración
As a matter of fact,
ideológica del
the
olvido hoy
ideological
en el
configuration
capitalismo
of
neoliberal
oblivion
es
today
el olvido
in
del
neoliberal
olvido.
capitalism is the
Olvidamos
oblivion
que
of
olvidamos.
oblivion. We forget
Olvidamos
that we
que
have
olvidamos
forgotten.
olvidar.
We
Y
forget that
ahí
we are
que
to forget.
olvidamos es que
And
estamos
what we
olvidando,
forget is
que
that we
algo
are
pasó y no
forgetting
estamos
that something
recordando.
happened and we are
Entonces,
not
este olvido de
remembering
olvidar
this.
de
So
nuestra
this oblivion of
coyuntura
oblivion in
no funciona
the
solo.
current
No
scenario
aparece
is no
flotando
longer
como
working.
una
It's
botella en
not
el mar
floating like a
y
bottle
este
in the
funcionamiento, este
sea. And this
engranaje de
functioning,
la
this
configuración
gearing
de la
of the
experiencia del
configuration
presente
of the
que se
time
da en esta
experience
coyuntura,
that takes place in this under these
bueno, me
conditions
parece que es interesante
or
poder
in this scenario.
pensarlo,
I
poder
think it's
pensarlo en
interesting
términos
to rethink it
sistemáticos,
in
sobre todo,
systematic
bueno,
terms,
en estos tiempos, valga la redundancia de
especially
la frase
in the
hecha.
times we're going through,
Entonces,
although it is a
me
redundancy.
gustaría hacer foco en
I like
cuatro
to focus
modos de este
on four
olvidar,
ways
olvidar,
of
cuatro
this
modos del
oblivion of
olvido,
oblivion,
algunos
four
en
types
términos
of oblivion
estructurales, algunos a nivel
from a
estructural
structural
y
approach,
otros en términos coyunturales,
but also
en
in
relación a cómo se configura nuestra
conditional
coyuntura
terms,
histórica.
how this is
Vamos con el primero.
conditioned in our
Un
structures.
primer gran olvido de
One major
este
oblivion
proceso de
of the
olvidar
whole
y que me
process
resulta
of
fundamental
forgetting,
traer, no lo
and
puedo
I'd like to
obviar,
share
es
this
que
issue. I'd like to
una de las
raise this issue.
características que
One
también
of the features
define
that
nuestro
also
modo de producción,
defines
o
our
digo
way of
nuestro, pero
producing,
cualquier modo de
not our
producción,
way of
es su
producing, but any
temporalidad.
way of producing,
Un
is
modo de
its
producción
temporality,
también
a
es un
production
modo
way.
de organización del
It's
tiempo.
a way to
El
organize
capitalismo
time.
como modo, como
Capitalism,
sistema de producción,
as
como
a
tal,
production system,
funciona estableciendo
works
determinadas relaciones sociales de
establishing
producción
special social relationships, a given structure that takes shape, that takes shape, and this conformation works in a specific way for each condition. And the structure and process, this production and reproduction process for social relationships implies and defines a specific temporality that is not owned by the organizing system, how men and women define and produce their livelihoods. But I'd like to emphasize that this production and this reproduction of social relationships requires some time that is not always the same. Therefore, it is important to highlight that this time of reproduction of social relationships and production relationships implies the so-called experientiality, the ideological experientiality of time. And this ideological experientiality of time is related to the time of reproduction of social relationships. And this place for reproduction of social relationships for production, this is the place for naturalization of production time. This is the time when time turns out as this unique time, a given time, an eternal time, a time in which, well, the time of the daily life and the time we have to go through, the time we have left, the way of organizing time in a production way is also one of the marks of its distinction in relation to other ways of production. Capitalism is also a specific way of organizing time. There is a double standard. Time is a social relationship, but also a measure of social relationships. That's highlighted by Mrs. Rosa. Having said that, there is a second way of oblivion, the second oblivion of oblivion. What we forget that we forgot is that our time, as I was saying early on, our time is not our time. Rather than that, it's our times in plural. And the way I have to be able to start disassembling our times is that there are multiple times in relation to given scenario. There are a given scenario, there are no multiple times, but they rather turn up as a single one. And they think that multiple temporalities in a given scenario, it's to be able to put time in relationship with history. That's multiple living. It reaffirms a multiplicity of temporal structures. They are differentially articulated and they operate in each scenario. This differential articulation is precisely articulating inequally temporary structures. There are subordinations, there are displacements, there are torsions and twists. And this shapes a totality, specific totality for each scenario with its specificities, but mainly with specific predominance for each structure, specific predominances in terms of temporary structures for each case. This implies that each social shaping has a specific articulation of structural time structures. So each social formation is seen as temporized times. Temporality in a social relationship is a single temporality. And this is the ideological operation in itself. The configuration of an evidence of a time as the time. The operation of simplification and flattening, naturalization of temporality or temporalization as a given time, as a cadence, as a dominant noise. This does not only imply a time in terms the significance of a time as a single time. It shapes various ways, establishing imaginary representation, symbolic representation, not only about time, but also about our affections, about the temporary way to relate to time, about our experiences, about our urgencies, our delays, our despair, our acceleration. Because when we talk about ideological configurations, we don't see that as a set of ideas, but the way of life, the way we relate to the world. What characterizes our affections, our way we are affected by the world. So how we shape ourselves in the world as individuals. Therefore, the individual form is overdetermined, it's temporalized in structural terms. What's the ideological? The ideological configuration is precisely this experience of life as a time, our time, a single time, or our time. But in fact, as a matter of fact, in a scenario, there are different articulated times. You can see that in times of crisis because of the explosion of the normalization of a single time, as we experienced through the pandemic, and especially with the compulsory isolation in countries where the isolation took longer, even worse, as in Argentina. The years operation of homogenization, simplification, naturalization, which is very complex, a differential articulation of time structures that arises as very simple. It is ignored and neglected, not only because it is flattened and absolute, but also because the ideology covers its footsteps in the oblivion of oblivion. When it comes to oblivion of oblivion. So that's the third way of forgetting what we forgot, which I see as I was saying, capitalism is also a temporary way. Neoliberalism is also temporary. It's also temporary. But my approach is different. The way I see it, neoliberalism is also an operation on time, but an operation on time because it characterizes a specific ideological configuration. It's not about a pace of a temporal system. It characterizes a ideological time configuration as a process. Neoliberalism is a temporary process, or a neoliberal trend, a neoliberalization process. When we think about the absolute time over another time, the result is the acceptance of an illusion. Therefore, the spectral presence of a time, making the assumption of this totality, if you think about that in psychoanalytical terms. You know, if you think about fullness from this approach, so there is a tempo, there is a value of temporary condition and scenario about present time, but they are flattened time. As if we had a tortilla or a pancake in a single layer, one on top of each other. This specific logical configuration of the liberal time, I call it the presidential regime, this time way as an experiential configuration. Oh, when I talk about experiential configuration, I'm not talking about a individualism. It's about material terms. The terms I described earlier. It's another instance that defines the social structure, the scenario. It's not a bias structure or it's about the experience as the sum of the parts, but it's a configuration of significances and social assumption as a specific dimension for the social totality.
Therefore, I'm getting a little bit farther from this subjective temporality. With which regard? Well, it doesn't mean any period of time, cosmovision, or a subjective perspective. It is something that is interrelated and structured through historic processes that are the ones that prevail in this ideology configuration. And suddenly, I'm right now in this fourth point to forget the oblivion and what we live in this absolute present moment in time as a way to adopt our time ideology. With this title, The Regime of a Present Times, that's where I develop some of my ideas, trying to make some clarifications. Why I'm talking about clarifications? Because this time configuration implies loads of articulated times, and those are ideology operations, and this absolutist time goes over the others. And dominantly, we always talk about the instant successes and events, one after the other. What I'm talking about clarifications, well, in the end, when we try to configure an ideology in today's time, we can see some temporary trends that create synergies and contradictions, but in such a way that they are structured towards the ephemeris and instantaneity. Thus, this doesn't mean that, well, this doesn't mean that there is another clash of ideologies through time. In reality, many, many times, I wonder if it's necessary to keep this title, mainly when we think about Latin American societies, because I do believe that this prospective time of the locomotive, and also still it's very, very hard when developing meanings and affections. And suddenly it comes to my mind this doubt, a doubt that I'd like to share with you for our next debate. When we made an analysis of Piaget materialism of the discourse perspective, we realized that there is a high level of multiplicity when dealing with future projections. We talk about these paranoid prospections, such as where there are multiple prospections, hyper technology, catastrophe, futures, the right order, technological futures, everything defined through these ideas, right? But this is just some food for thoughts, but it's something that I'd like to share with you afterwards. Once we go to this instant present regime, but it's really important to me about the presentism of these historiography theories when up creating an absolute present moment in time, it is that it's really entrenched with the spasmodic times, this repetition time that really offers the intelligibility in itself, and how to reaffirm the present, how to vindicate uncertainty, contingencies, in order to recognize this multidirectionality that imposes instantaneity, the urgency of the immediate, how everything is overlapped, as Maphosoli says, living the eternal quotidianity. How to project, in the end, this moment in time, that it's interrelated with this egoic temporality. Freud speaks about the subject temporality of the biography, the materiality of the discourse. History begins with myself. That place where time, it's bended. It's bended under the biographical time. Therefore, there is kind of a relationship between history and time, and we can witness a egoic history that doesn't allow to have a prospection of the utopian times. There is not a possibility to prospect the instantaneous logic of things, always relying on this lack of memory, the impossibility to project the future as this egoic time of the urgency moment and of the right now. So there is not a structure on the present, on the uncertainty of the future, a future that it's completely out of the today and the present time. So there is an exacerbation of the ephemeris towards a quality that it reinforces the death certainty. It's strengthened through the certainty of death, but also oneness, unicity. We are strengthening death certainty and how to take advantage of life. The only thing that goes quicker, it is the ephemeris and how to treasure that. There is a high, let's say, valorization of routines and taking advantage of the micro moments. And suddenly, there is not a way backwards towards the past. And we are always anchored in the present, this micro temporality, when having these long temporary lines of the processes that really make us to go back to a longer prescription of time. Suddenly, I realize that I'm going backwards to this neo-vitalism, a neo-vitalism that doesn't acknowledge the death certainty, sorry, whether it recognizes the death certainty, it is not a big party. It is not a party, as we would say here in Argentina, right? It's not a vital experience. It's just living the instant. It's recognizing the death, but it doesn't. It's not a recognition of the value of the instant, of the moment. It's something that it's compulsory. You must take and enjoy and take part, also to enjoy the suffering projected always in the right now, in this right now, in this moment in time, in this completely uh, eternal, instant, paradoxal moment in time, in this reloaded vitalism when we are facing this death certainty. In order to conclude, what I'd like to share with you, it is the next question. How can we create memory? To me, memory is a practice. To me, memory, it is the practice of the non-naturalization of the oblivion. To me, memory is also wondering about time, it's wondering about history, temporality. In this concept of instantaneity, it's very difficult not to think about the processes of memory, memorization as well, and secondly, as something that it's like a spasm, it's like a burst of memory. To me, there are different processes of memory, and I can see like two moments in time. We have the non-ideological moment of memory, something that will transform and create memories that really imposes to cut this temporary line, to cut with the ideologies, and suddenly we have something that it's homogeneous and it's totally closed, something that breaks with the ideology configuration that was the dominant one, that render invisibility towards the history processes. And to me, this memory process is completely transformative. But on the other hand, we have this diluted memory, this capitalistic memory, this dominant line of memory that recovers the history processes in a diluted manner, right? In a decaffeinated manner. A memory that proposes a hidden and masked processes that really cut in order to re-strengthen the present in this, let's say, self-heroic moment, in this lack of historicity and without any kind of common projection of building new communities, building collectivities and communities without any kind of a future community transformation, totally anchored in this present, in the urgent moment of time, in a time that is absolutely thought and reflected over himself and itself. Therefore, to me, memory belongs to this absolute ideology fight to recover this process of history in order to transform collectivity, to build this transformation feature. And on the other hand, it is, well, a mummified and decaffeinated memory where there is just the self-fulfillment, and it depends on us, the place that we are going to give it to them. Thank you very much, Carolina. Thank you so much for this amazing intervention that in the end it's going to feed our future debates. And with any further, I'd like to give the floor to Ana Carolina Barbosa Pereira. Thank you so much for your kind participation. You have the floor, Ana Carolina. Hello, can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Fernando Nicolazzi and Carolina Bauer. Thank you so much. Well, because I've been developing with you two long experiences, and we have a very fruitful interaction. And thank you so much for once again giving me the opportunity to share with you some of the ideas, some of the issues, and some of the comments that really make sense for my research. Thank you so much, Carolina Re. I really had a lot of fun when listening to you. And in the end, what I'd like to offer to you through my words, maybe it's not my main topic of the research that I made, but I'm trying to dialogue with some questions that were proposed to all of us to think, and this kind of invitation, it's very important to me because in the end, I do have a question always in my mind. I wake up in the morning with this question in my mind. I go to bed with this question in my mind. When I do have fun, once again, I wonder about the question. Therefore, it's just an attempt to have a dialogue with all these questions and issues, not necessarily to give you an answer, despite I made a huge effort to offer a solution and also to try to design and to have a profile in order to solve this question. And with this regard, two questions came to my mind, two questions that I want to read with you. I'm going to introduce what I try to mention or to name it like this attempt to give an answer. Well, the first question has to do with, is it possible to have this specific and if the answer could be positive, what could be the main features of the memory when dealing with a memory of capitalism? Well, since the beginning, when the idea of thinking about capitalism memory, and it was something that you shared with me, I thought that it was very important and very original, and also in such a way it offered me a different perspective of interpretations that were more inclusive. But on the other hand, it was very challenging to me in such a way that I had to justify all the efforts that I made to create a profile about these capitalism memories. Since the beginning, I always thought about the next idea. What's the concept? What's the term of a memory of capitalism? What do I think when I think about memories of capitalism? What's the relationship of all the items and all the phenomena and subjects? And in order to get closer and to have an intersectional and a cross-related and to find these common connecting dots that will include these memories of capitalism, I myself, I went back to the idea of the abstraction paradigm by Charlie Gere, the author that does not exclusively speak, not exclusively speaks about this paradigm of abstraction, quantification, self-regulation, standardization, mechanization, so on and so forth. I do believe that it is possible to make this category more operational. It is important to systematize and to create a synthesis of all these terms and to include them in this idea of a paradigm of the abstraction. Thus, I'd like to create a way to develop the memories of capitalisms. What are the features of these memories of capitalisms? Having a dialogue always with the idea of a abstraction paradigm. I do believe that this is a category that really allows to think and precisely to think under a long-lasting perspective that will allow us to better assess these historical processes, to better know the actions that are not only based on abstraction, but also in self-automation, codification, decodification, recodification, all these categories that are together with us for many, many years. And maybe this Charlie gets a line will allow us to develop a better consolidation, the so-called digital culture that was developed by himself. Therefore, I think that kind of there is kind of a difference of a Charlie Gate lines. And something came to my mind once a PhD student, Gabriel Gonzaga, he told me, it was, I think, during a workshop that we were developing together with Lupa, the University of Rio Grande do Sul, and we were dealing with the problem of a Charlie Gate interpretation and how to set this historical framework of the abstraction paradigm in this first industrial revolution. And Gabriel Gonzaga told me that there was already a debate and a discussion that was very long, very dense, very robust, very old debate in order to think about the experience of African slavery in the Americas as an experience of abstraction that really participates in this historical process to develop capitalism system and to create this concept, the concept of work as a good, as a something to trade with, as something abstract. The way that I conceive this paradigm of abstraction already takes into account this observation. Despite myself, I didn't progress as much as I would like to do it in this regard, and to, in a nutshell, let's say, see what's the role of slavery in the thinking and also in the political economy fields. Well, in any case, I'm just thinking that all these codification and abstraction operations, they do incorporate this historical experience of the first industrial revolution and beyond, but the different perspective of Charlie Gett made me to go backwards, and together with Gabriel Gonzaga, allowed me to gather all these operations as experiences that were designed mainly through decolonization experiences in the American continent, the indigenous slavery, as well as the African slavery in the Americas, and lately the experience of industrialization and the appearance and consolidation of the so-called information society, right? So, with this regard, I do believe that there is kind of a tiny change when dealing with this new direction that I took in the past, where I had a dialogue together with Lupa and Fernando Nicolazzi and Carolina Bauer. Well, in any case, why do we have to think about this abstraction paradigm to place and to profile the memories of capitalism? There is a reason to do it. So the power of the synthesis, the power of offering and rendering a mental image that will be able to include this diversity, the complexity of experiences as well. And on the other hand, because these operations, these abstraction operations, they are behind or they belong to something that allow the capitalism system to work as a universal machine able to deal with very different phenomena in such a way that they do seem similar phenomena, but they can be exchangeable. So how we change goods, the use of goods, the standardization of labor, the underlying abstraction of the banknotes and money, also the market as the main regulator. So all these ideas, all these abstractions, they are vital conditions in order to develop the capitalism system because they allow the flow of goods, money, people, which are fundamental to expropriate and to gather and to create these lucrative activities and to increase the level of greed in human beings. But on the other hand, we must go backwards and we need to rethink the origin of this paradigm and how from this paradigm we could rethink a development of history of the extractive dynamics as inherent part of the capitalistic system development. That's where I do create this dialogue together with Sara Maria Sorrentino that is aiming towards the opposite way when she made these macroeconomic assessments about capitalism placing slavery experience in the Americas as something that was not thought by the political economy. However, all the colonialism experiences, as well as slavery in the Americas, incorporates in different stages the production of Marx. But under the perspective made by Sara Maria Sorrentino, it is more than possible to think slavery not as abstraction versus something specific and concrete and materiality. It is not a dimension going against the concrete and the effects that slavery lived. They are always material effects, but this allows us to think slavery as an experience more abstract that thinks and rethinks and prepares the idea that slavery is a good to trade with. Thus, well, this helps us to think about Sorrentino's ideas. This slave as an abstract that it's totally outside, that shows the experience of slavery, African slavery. It really precedes and makes real the historical phenomena and theoretical phenomena of labor. So, the conceptualization of this abstract labor, labor as a good to trade with, made us to think that it did not begin with the work in the factories in the context of the first industrial revolution. We have a previous history context, but it is in a different temporality, in a different moment in time that made us to think about different social groups as well. So, in this sense, we are distorting the time of narratives made by Charlie Getz and the development of a digital culture coming from the abstraction paradigm, and also to carry on with another dimension that says that it's not possible to think about the standardization, mechanization, automatization, and codification without placing them before in the context of the occurrence and colonialism development. And suddenly it came to my mind when I began to read about this abstraction and slavery that in a specific case for indigenous policy during the colonial times in Brazil, the indigenous, this difference between the indigenous that were ally of the Portuguese and those that were the enemies of the Portuguese. In those experiences, we can detect that there are standardization and abstraction of this colonialism domination that really showcases this racial standardization and abstraction during colonialism. I'm talking here about the how language was imposed, the colonial languages, and also all the the mandates of the Jesuitic centers. They wanted to Christianize all the indigenous, but also the slavery that the indigenous suffered not only in Brazil, in many other places of the American continent. And suddenly it came to my mind when I read some text by Sergio Solatas, the colonialism habit to, well, say that Malay people were very lazy. They were classified as lazy, and this made me to think about Antonio David works and many other authors trying to recover these polemics and the theories that really wanted to show the inferiority of the American continent and American people. Maybe there was a polemics between Clancy Buffon and many other authors that accused that American people they were very lazy, they were lower people, they were effeminated, They were not able to, well, to find. They were lazy all the time. They felt inferior. They were very feminine. They were not hairy. They were not able to dominate nature and women. Therefore, these are colonial criteria that really standardized the authority during colonialism. Beyond the abstraction of the slavery experience, there is another suggestion from my side that incorporate memories of capitalism that have to do with the alterity standardization during colonial times, in such a way that many authors, decolonial, such as Buquijano and many others, well, and Gilberto Spinoza, they show a trend when standardizing the colonial authority, marking and racializing through signs, marks, colonial marks that made people to belong to a race. So these categories that didn't exist before the colonial experiences, the Ron Connell says that this is the constitutive feature of the colonial experience. But in the end, what does it would mean to think about memories of capitalism from the abstraction paradigm placed in a colonial context and not in the first industrial revolution, such as point a starting point, right? So I do think how to think memories of capitalism and not only as a phenomenon of expropriation, and also how to start with the experiences global and standardization, and also how to, in this perspective, it is, well, very important to know as a first experience of standardization, not only the industrial products and the division ways of labor that were the ones that really featured the first industrial revolution, that were showed through Charles Chaplin images in a Modern Times movie. This foundational experience of standardization that really constitutes one of the bases of capitalism, and consequently an element that really incorporates the memories of capitalism. So this is the experience of racialization and the colonial alterity distributed in racial categories that really uh, create a mass of people that mark people with this colonial sign, and they are seen as something common, and the black, Mexican, mixed races that, well, standardized by groups in whole continents. These really characterize the capitalistic experience as a non-broken historic phenomena. It's a long-lasting phenomenon. This is one of the main features of capitalism, this plasticity in the sense of updating, renewing the colonial forms of racial classification. So, in order to maintain these asymmetries and these inequalities as well, that we can witness when racialization is produced. Thus, as memories of capitalism, racialization really has this place, which is a foundational place, and it's a long-lasting moment. We are witnessing in an indirect manner the racialization that is documented in a colonial archives, but also in a straightforward way, we've been witnessing on a daily basis. These are the biases, the algorithms, racial elements of AI that really include technology elements and the way to think and different ways to make things happen that really belong to the culture, a narrative that we have in our contemporary times to better structure this contemporary culture in order to get rid of the trauma of colonialism. Therefore, I think that it is possible to better systematize this attempt to offer an answer, to systematize and to think the memories of capitalism from the idea and from the paradigm of abstraction. However, this distortion in space-time and also a Charlie Gay perspective, going backwards temporarily, and also from a space perspective, going backwards to the 15th and 16th century, mainly in the Americas and in Africa to place this history experience, this global historical experience of abstraction and standardization. The second question, I don't know if I'll be able to answer. In order to respect my 20 minutes, I'd like to share my question and also to showcase what are my main directions and the attempts that I had to answer to the second question. Otherwise, we'll have time during the discussion if it's possible. And the second question would be the next one. How capitalism history is interrelated with the different social and cultural situations when we produce the memory works. That's an attempt that I made in order to scratch the surface of the question, offering also another answer to the previous questions. I think that the interaction between history of capitalism, the culture environment where we can see the memory works really implies from our side to think differently the different adjustments of history, linearity, and circularity and rupture from all the historical subjects that belong to the matrix of a colonialism, a race that are very unequal. In such a way, and in a very objective way, we must acknowledge that were differently impacted by the processes of expropriation, also predation of capitalism as well, of the system.
Da localização geopolítica, ou para usar uma categoria que tem sido mobilizada
to use a category that has been mobilized to take into consideration these complexities, our crossroads in terms of belonging. To give you an example about the complexity and this difference in the way we are affected, there are racial categories involved, racialized categories, and they make up historically vulnerable groups. For example, I can think of the Linda Smith approach. To the difference between the material reality of indigenous peoples, and they depend on their own journeys. And she makes a comparison, the reality of indigenous peoples in New Zealand with the reality of indigenous peoples in Latin America. They are completely different. That's an example she quotes in New Zealand. There is no issue of water access to lands or territories. How we face it in our country and how we witness on a daily basis, for example, in my country, Brazil. So I'd like to highlight that we are differently affected by the historicity of capitalism. And the way we are differently affected is also related to this belonging idea. And to conclude, I'd like to quote a case of Yanomami, the Yanomami peoples. They are an icon of violence suffered by indigenous people in terms of the acceleration and predation of the capitalist system in the era of the so-called surveillance capitalism, platform surveillance capitalism. We consider that capitalism is no longer capitalism, but even worse, a war system with an acquired dimension. And Yanomami peoples, as we saw in the reports in January this year, they are at the heart of the crisis, especially because in this territory there's still illegal mining. The gold miners is one of the indispensable ores to nourish the machines of AI and digital culture. I'm quoting Yanomami. I mention them because in metaphysics and in Schopenhauer and the economics of nature, this is a sophisticated system that makes us think of this universe, as Karina said, about the regime of historicity and the Anthropocene the
pela história
capitalism,
ali da queda do céu, da história potencial,
the
e
potential
da
history,
metafísica da predação.
and the metaphysics
Mas aí
of
eu deixo
predation.
para desenvolver mais isso, se for o caso,
But I can elaborate on
para
that
perguntas, para poder respeitar
after the
o tempo,
Q&A,
extrapolando um pouquinho,
if I
mas
may,
participando
because
disso.
I'm exceeding my
Muito
time.
obrigada pela
So
oportunidade
apologies. Thank you so
de
much for the
fazer com
invitation
vocês.
so that I can have this conversation with you. Thank you so much, Anna. I'd like to thank you, both of you, for your participation at the first roundtable in this seminar. We kicked off this seminar with some delay, so we have reorganized and reshuffled everything. We are going to move to the second session so we can have some time for the Q&A and we can ask some questions.